Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Laura Lovers and I am the Chief Scientific Officer for Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, or CURE. I want to thank you all for joining us today. CURE is pleased to continue our Leaders in Epilepsy Research webinar series in 2018. This series started in just last year. And this year's series will consist of multiple webinars throughout the year that highlight some of the key research that's being done in epilepsy. Today's webinar, which is being sponsored by our friends at Synovian, will focus on the latest research in epilepsy drug development and will be presented by Dr. Jacqueline French. CURE's mission is to identify and fund cutting-edge research in search of a cure for epilepsy. In fact, we are celebrating 20 years of impact in the field of epilepsy research this year. CURE has been instrumental in advancing the science of epilepsy research in many areas, including post-traumatic epilepsy, infantile spasms, devices and technology, sudden unexpected death in epilepsy or SUDEP, and epilepsy genetics, just to name a few areas. Today's webinar is entitled Promising Anti-Epileptic Drugs in Development, and will outline new therapies that are currently in development for epilepsy, including a number of promising therapies for patients with treatment-resistant epilepsy, children with severe epilepsy, and drugs that actually may not only treat seizures, but improve the underlying disease. It is my deep pleasure to introduce Dr. Jacqueline French, who is a professor of neurology in the Comprehensive Epilepsy Center at NYU Langone School of Medicine. She is also the founder and director of the Epilepsy Study Consortium, an academic group that has performed a number of early phase clinical trials in epilepsy and has developed new methodologies for epilepsy clinical trials. Over the past 20 years, Dr. French has served as the principal investigator on a number of trials for new epilepsy drugs and is responsible for the creation of new clinical trial designs that have been accepted by regulatory authorities for new drug approval. Dr. French has been active in creating guidelines for the American Academy of Neurology and the International League Against Epilepsy, and she chaired a joint committee that produced two widely quoted guidelines on the use of new anti-epileptic drugs. Dr. French also serves as the Chief Scientific Officer of the Epilepsy Foundation. She is the past president of the American Epilepsy Society and past secretary of the American Society for Experimental Neurotherapeutics. She's received numerous awards for her service to the epilepsy community. She's authored over 200 articles and book chapters and is the editor of 3 books. She also lectures internationally on clinical trials and the use of anti-epileptic drugs. Quite a long, successful contribution to the epilepsy community. Before Dr. French begins, I'd like to encourage everyone to ask questions. You may submit your questions anytime during the presentation by typing them into the Questions tab of the GoToWebinar Control panel and clicking Send. My colleague from CURE, Brandon Laughlin, will read them aloud during the Q&A portion of the webinar. We do want this webinar to be as interactive and as informative as possible. However, to respect everyone's privacy, we ask that you make your questions general and not specific to a loved one's epilepsy. I also want to mention that today's webinar, as well as all previous and future webinars, will be recorded and available on the CURE website. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. French.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about my favorite topic, which is what's new and what's coming in the epilepsy pipeline. I want to start out by just giving my disclosures. I'm president, as you heard, of the Epilepsy Study Consortium. And if you look at the names of all of the different companies that are on this slide, it actually makes me very happy because that means that all of these companies, in one form or another, have an interest in developing new therapies for epilepsy, and we work with all of them. Any funding that comes from that goes back to the Epilepsy Study Consortium. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about anti-epileptic drug development. And as you can see from this slide, with a somewhat slower start over the last 20 years or so, we have seen a skyrocketing of new therapies for epilepsy. But of course, that doesn't mean that we do not have an unmet need. And in fact, recent studies have suggested that despite all of the drugs in red that have been developed and approved over the last 20 years, we still have 1/3 of people with epilepsy whose seizures are not controlled by conventional medication. I just want to call out that we have had a recent approval, which is for the drug brivaracetam or Briviact, which was just approved within the last 12 months. There are some very important trends for the next decade of anti-epileptic drug development that I want to talk about. One is the concept of from blockbuster to mini buster, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The second one is the issue of targeting and focusing on treatment-resistant epilepsies. And then finally, the very exciting concept of moving from anti-seizure drugs to anti-epilepsy drugs. So let me start with the concept of from blockbuster to mini buster. So to date, all of the drugs that I showed you on that impressive first slide have been developed primarily for the common epilepsies. And those are the focal epilepsies, which are seizures that start at one or two focal areas in the brain and cause focal seizures, focal aware, focal impaired awareness, or focal to bilateral convulsive seizures. Those are almost all the trials, in fact, that have been done. And then the second group that has been subjected to trials is people with what we call idiopathic or genetic generalized epilepsy who have generalized tonic-clonic convulsions as a consequence of that. And together, these two syndromes alone account for about 3/4 of all people who have epilepsy, whether they be children or adults. But all of the development in those two areas has definitely left a large portion, that other quarter of people, sort of behind. And those are the people, particularly children, who suffer from the rarer epilepsies. And sometimes we call them the orphan epilepsies. And now, instead of going for the larger groups, there are a lot of companies that are focusing on these rare or orphan epilepsies where there are no good treatments. And that's a good thing because these orphan epilepsies actually have a much higher likelihood of being treatment resistant and rather severe. So the majority now of development is for the rare epilepsies rather than for the common ones. So we used to have one big target, which was the focal epilepsies, and now we have mini targets: Dravet, tuberous sclerosis, GLUT1 deficiency, CDKL5, Rett syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut are among the rare epilepsies that are now the targets for drug therapy. So why has this occurred? Why are people so interested in rare epilepsies? Well, for one thing, as we understand more and more about these rare epilepsies, we find that there often is a genetic underpinning or some understanding of why these epilepsies occur. So there's more chance for a unifying underlying cause for these epilepsies than for the focal epilepsies, which are basically caused by anything that can injure the brain, whether it be a stroke or a tumor or a cortical dysplasia. There are many, many causes. The second thing is, as we said, there are a lot of drugs that have been approved in the focal epilepsy space. The marketplace for these rarer epilepsies is not as crowded, although I will say it's getting more and more crowded by the day. The third thing is that often patient and parent groups are available and motivated to speed development in these areas, and that is extremely important. These groups and smaller organizations can quickly identify patients, can get excitement in the community. So sometimes that helps with the development of the drug and the recruitment for trials, and even for finding funding for these smaller companies. Another very important issue is that the rare or orphan diseases get special benefits from regulators, including the Food and Drug Administration. that are intended appropriately to motivate drug development in areas that otherwise there may not be any drugs. So they don't have to do as many trials in some circumstances, and they get longer exclusivity for their drug once it's on the market. Finally, unfortunately, perhaps one of the downsides is that once developed, when there is only a small number of patients that are going to receive the drug can command a premium price in the marketplace. And insurers that would definitely balk at paying a premium price for a very large number of people will say, well, it's okay if we're only paying for a small number of people. And sometimes these therapies, depending on the size of the marketplace, can command, $100,000 or more price tags. So these are things that we also have to keep an eye on. So I have a rather busy slide here that shows you how many different drugs are being developed for orphan syndromes. And I'm not going to have time to talk about every single one of them, but I am going to focus on a couple of them that I thought you might be interested in. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about Epidiolex or cannabidiol, which is in development for Dravet, Lennox-Gastaut, and seizures associated with tuberous sclerosis. I'm going to talk a little bit about fenfluramine, which is in development for Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut. And to get back to the more common epilepsies, I am going to talk about inhaled alprazolam, which is a drug that is in development for anybody who has seizures in clusters, no matter whether it's focal or generalized or in an orphan syndrome. So it's more for the general population of people with epilepsy. So I'm going to start talking about CBD, cannabidiol, or Epidiolex, and obviously there's a great deal of interest in our community around Epidiolex. And in fact, the Food and Drug Administration very soon is going to be having an advisory panel to discuss whether this drug will be approved by the FDA for the treatment of Dravet syndrome. And I'm showing you here some of the data from the Dravet syndrome study. And I actually saw a press report today saying that the FDA has stated that they feel that the company has provided reasonable data to support an approval of this drug, which is, of course, good news for everybody in the community who's waiting for the drug to be approved. And once the drug is approved and there is a medical use for it, CBD will no longer be Schedule 1, which makes it very, very difficult for people to get a hold of. But once there is a medical use, hopefully at least it will be downgraded to a Schedule 2 drug. Again, that will make it much easier for doctors to prescribe it. So here you see the results in convulsive seizures. And what this is a graph that shows you the approximate percent reduction on average that each of these children experienced who was in the trial. The green bar is the children who the children who were on placebo or a sugar pill. And you can see that they did have a reduction also, which is always kind of interesting. Why do people who have a sugar pill added have a reduction in their seizures? And some of it could be just that people have an increase in seizures, are more likely to enroll in trials, and seizures have a tendency to ebb and flow. So they may just, have gone up right before the trial started that made people more motivated to go into the trial, and then just naturally they go back down again. But also it may be that people have such high hopes when they go into a trial that they actually get better just from the expectations that they will get better. But if you see the blue line is the people who, sorry, I clicked when I shouldn't have clicked. The blue line is the people who were actually getting the active drug, and this was a blinded study, which means that neither the doctors who were recruiting people into the trial nor the patients themselves knew which group they were in, the treated group or the placebo or sugar pill group. And you can see that the people who got the drug had about a 40% overall reduction in convulsive seizures. This is for Dravet, which is a very severe childhood onset epilepsy associated with a genetic abnormality. So again, this is an indication that this drug is in fact effective for people with seizures, and you can see on the other side of the slide is an indication of the reduction in total seizures. Now, that's slightly less than the reduction in convulsive seizures, but still much, much greater than the reduction that's seen in the people who had the sugar pill. So again, this is very good evidence that's going to go before the Food and Drug Administration that says, yes, this drug does have an impact on epilepsy and reduces seizures. Now, there are people who say, well, I want cannabidiol or CBD because it's a natural compound and it's unlike a drug, and I want something that's more natural and doesn't have side effects. But I am here to tell you that CBD or cannabidiol is indeed a drug, and it does indeed have side effects. And this slide is here to sort of demonstrate that point. So you can see that all-cause side effects in the people who had CBD added to their regimen, the children, as opposed to having placebo added to their regimen, had more side effects of any cause. Interestingly enough, even those who went on the sugar pill had additional side effects. But if you look at the side effects that the doctors thought were related to treatment, then you start to see quite a big difference, where you can see that 70% of the children who were on the active drug had side effects related to the treatment, whereas only 27% of those on the sugar pill had side effects related to the treatment. And in fact, about 15% of the children who were on the active drug had to come off of treatment because of those side effects, as opposed to only 1.7% of those with the sugar pill. When you look at people who had serious, what they considered to be serious side effects, again, you see about 3 times as many had serious side effects when they were on the active drug as compared to the placebo. And this is not uncommon for new therapies, and it's not certainly not worse than any of the other new therapies that we have, but this drug does have side effects like other new therapies. And you can see that at the top of the list was sleepiness and diarrhea and decreased appetite and fatigue. And some of these were actually related to interactions with other drugs that the children were taking. That has to be kept in mind, and that is why this drug is best used in conjunction with medical supervision. Some of these side effects included abnormal liver functions, and that happened particularly when CBD was combined with valproic acid or Depakote. And the sleepiness was much more significant when the drug was combined with clobazam or Onfi, because CBD does cause an increase in the amount of the CBD or Onfi that is in the bloodstream due to an interaction. So that's why it's important that there be a doctor who's sort of supervising all of this when CBD is added. I also wanted to show you the results in another Dravet study. Perhaps people are not as familiar with this drug, and they should be. This is fenfluramine from a company called Zogenix. They also did a study in children with this severe epilepsy called Dravet syndrome. And here you can see that they actually, at the higher dose, compared to 7.5% of the children who had a 50% reduction in seizures with the sugar pill, 70% of these children had a 50% reduction in seizures with fenfluramine. And when you look at the number of children who had a 75% reduction, that was even less common in the children who had the sugar pill. But 45% at the higher dose of fenfluramine had a 75% reduction in seizures. This was significant enough that the FDA is considering this as a breakthrough therapy. And that is a big deal. What does that mean? That means that the Food and Drug Administration is saying, we think that your drug has sufficient data that it is going to substantially benefit people with epilepsy, or people, in, depending on the indication, that it is our responsibility as the government to help you get this on the market as quickly as possible so that people can benefit from it as quickly as possible. And there has not been a drug designated as a breakthrough therapy in the epilepsy space. So this is a real indicator from the FDA that they are excited about this data, and we should be too. Again, no drug is without risks and side effects as well as its benefits. Fenfluramine actually used to be part of a combination therapy called fen-phen that some of you may remember, depending on how old you are, that was given as a treatment for obesity to make people lose weight. And it was pulled off the market because people were noted to have heart valve thickening as well as some pulmonary fibrosis. But that occurred only in the combination of fenfluramine and phentermine, and this is only fenfluramine that's being given now, and also the doses that were used were much higher. So we are hoping very much that at the lower doses that are being used and with fenfluramine alone, that this is not a risk, but obviously we have to keep a very, very close eye on the children who are being treated with this drug to make sure that they are not having heart valvular thickening or pulmonary fibrosis. Fortunately, you can look at this relatively easily with non-invasive tests, and if there is any indication that something is happening, one could remove the therapy before any serious damage happens, now that we know to look for this. But we are keeping a close eye on that. In addition, you can see that there were treatment emergent side effects, just as there were in the study of CBD, where 95% approximately of children on the active drug had side effects compared to only 65% on the sugar pill or placebo. But when you look at the number of children who had serious treatment emergent adverse events, there actually was not a substantial difference between those on the sugar pill and those on the active drug, and that obviously is very good news. I'm going to move on to talk about inhaled alprazolam. So we use a lot of drugs in the class called benzodiazepines, and you may have heard of Valium, which is diazepam, and Ativan, which is lorazepam. A lot of people use these as what we call rescue therapies to make their seizure clusters stop. But unfortunately, and they can use it as a pill, they can use it these days, it is possible to get it to be used in the nose, sometimes to be used as a buccal administration. But even when it's used in the nose and the buccal administration, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes before it works. And I shouldn't, by the way, forget to say that some people still use it rectally as diastat. But any of these ways that people use it, it still takes 10 to 15 minutes to work. And that is not helpful when you are, for example, having an aura for a seizure and you know that a minute from now you might be having a generalized convulsion, or you're having a cluster of myoclonic jerks that's going to go on for 15 to 20 minutes. You want something that works as fast as possible to stop the seizure activity. And the lung, fortunately, has a lot of area to absorb drug, and a rescue inhaler is a concept that people use for other conditions. Obviously, they use it for migraine, they use it for asthma. And the idea behind inhaled alprazolam is really to have a rescue inhaler for epilepsy, that at the first sign of trouble, if you have an aura or you start to have any type of seizure activity, if the individual is able to breathe in, then at that point, then they can breathe in through this device, and they can rapidly, perhaps within even seconds to minutes, to a minute or two, they can cause that seizure activity to stop. That is the goal. That is the hope. The device exists, the drug exists, and it's currently in very early trials. And hopefully those trials will be successful, and eventually this drug will prove to be of benefit to the community. I'm going to change gears now and talk about treating drug-resistant epilepsies. So as we talked about earlier on, 2/3 of people with the common epilepsies respond to the drugs that are now available. For the last several decades, all of the drugs that I showed you on the first slide in the figure that have been approved over the last many decades have initially been tested in treatment-resistant patients. However, they have not been specifically designed for use in treatment-resistant patients. This is a population, what we call a population of convenience. You obviously can't try new drugs in seizure-free patients because there's nothing to test against. So you're going to have to use treatment-resistant patients in your studies, but eventually the intent is that that drug, let me take an example of levetiracetam, Keppra, or lacosamide, Vimpat, that were initially tested in treatment-resistant patients, but eventually were used earlier and earlier in the lifespan of an epilepsy, and now are often used as in patients who just have been diagnosed or recently have been diagnosed. That is different from trying to develop a drug specifically to treat those treatment-resistant patients. So the new way of thinking is that epilepsies that don't respond to drugs are biologically different than epilepsies that do respond to drugs. And maybe we need different drugs to treat those epilepsies than the drugs that we have to treat newly diagnosed or more early epilepsies. And how are we going to find those drugs to treat the treatment resistant? Well, we need new animal models, for one thing, that are reflecting the patients who are treatment resistant rather than the population at whole, with the goal of creating a drug to work specifically for those patients. And fortunately, we do have some drugs that are under development. CBD gel is one of them, cenobamate, a drug called padcevanil, and another drug that also is in the cannabinoid line called cannabidivarin. And I am going to focus, because it's closest to the clinic, on a drug called cenobamate. So this drug actually has gone through the majority of the testing that it needs to go through in order to be approved by the FDA. So we're hoping that perhaps even within a year, it will be submitted to the FDA for approval. And you can see this is a very early trial that was done where, again, patients with treatment-resistant epilepsy were randomized in the trial, and this was a relatively short study. It was only 8 weeks in duration, as opposed to the typical study that's 12 weeks. But nonetheless, you can see that the individuals who were randomized to take the drug as opposed to take the placebo sugar pill, the ones that were randomized to the drug had actually 32% of them had a 90% reduction in seizures over that short period of time, granted, versus only 8% of those who were randomized to the sugar pill. And when you look at the ones who had no seizures over the course of the trial, more than a quarter of them, and these are treatment-resistant patients who had failed many, many other drugs before that, a quarter of them did not have any seizures over the course of the trial, as opposed to the patients who were randomized to the placebo. So this is a drug that we believe does have the possibility of taking people who have not responded to other drugs and making them seizure-free. And many of those patients were then continued in a long-term extension of the trial and were found to remain seizure-free during the long-term extension of the trial. So this is an exciting drug. Again, it's not without its side effects. When you go higher on the dose, it does make people fatigued, and it does make people have dizziness at higher doses, and there is a risk of a rash, which is also a common risk with other anti-epileptic medications that people are put on. So it's not one that we don't understand or haven't dealt with before. But nonetheless, it's important to know. But this does represent a really promising new approach for people who have not responded to other medications in the past. Now I want to switch gears and talk about the idea of anti-epilepsy drugs versus anti-seizure drugs. So all of the drugs available currently to treat epilepsy are actually anti-seizure drugs. That means that they don't act to stop the cause of seizures. They just block the excitation or increase inhibition in the brain or prevent repetitive firing in the brain to block the seizures. And the analogy that I often use with my patients when I'm talking about this is, imagine that your seizures are a big, nasty, ugly spider that just crawled out from someplace and is sitting in front of you, ready to bite you. And if I were to take a cup and put it over the spider, then I would neutralize the spider. It couldn't bite you, it couldn't hurt you, and everything would be fine. However, I have not in any way, shape, or form done anything to the spider. And eventually, if medications are withdrawn or I lift that cup in my analogy, then the spider might still be there and it might still be just as virulent as when the cup went over it. Perhaps the spider passed away from old age while it's under the cup or whatever. And so, sometimes when we take the medications away, no more seizures happen. But with the cup over the spider, we have no idea whether that spider is alive or dead. And that is the same thing that's true when we give anti-seizure medications. We've just neutralized the seizures, but we have done nothing to actually change the disease. But as we gain better understanding of what causes seizures, and unfortunately in many people we still don't know what causes their seizures, but as we gain a better understanding, we hope that we can change from anti-seizure drugs to anti-epilepsy drugs. And, in my example, this would be, some sort of poison that would actually neutralize the spider. And if we did have such a treatment, it could actually lead to what we call disease modification, which means that over time, perhaps you could eliminate the risk of seizures, eliminate the excitability in the brain, and no longer need medication. And we would be getting closer to what we might call, and this is obviously relevant here, a cure, because that's what this organization is all about, is cure. So I am very happy to say that just last week, a drug that is our first real approach to an anti-epilepsy drug was approved by the FDA for a very specific type of epilepsy. And this is a drug that works on something called the mTOR pathway. It's rather complicated scientifically, but mTOR stands for the mammalian target of rapamycin. And it's a signaling pathway that regulates how brain cells grow, differentiate, and multiply. And in some people, they have a gene defect that causes this particular pathway just to go wild. And brain cells are growing and multiplying in a way that's just erratic and leads to poor connections between, it leads to several things, but it leads to poor connections that can cause excitability in the brain. And the people who have this genetic defect have a disease called tuberous sclerosis complex. We think that this mTOR pathway going awry may also lead to another type of epilepsy called cortical dysplasia, although the the evidence is not quite as clear. With tuberous sclerosis complex, we know for a fact that there is a defect in the gene that regulates the mTOR pathway, and that is why they have this disease, tuberous sclerosis. So we know also that in animal models, if you can find a drug that inhibits or tamps down this mTOR pathway, you can prevent or reverse epilepsy caused by these illnesses. And we now have a drug, and it's actually been available for quite a while as a chemotherapeutic agent called everolimus. And everolimus is known to be an inhibitor of the mTOR pathway. And because it is used as a chemotherapeutic agent against tumors, it was tried in children with tuberous sclerosis who developed these tumors in their brain called giant cell astrocytomas. And as you can see on this MRI that I'm showing you here in this child, a big tumor was shrunk down in this child by being on everolimus. But as these children with tuberous sclerosis, who also happen to have epilepsy, were getting treated for their tumors, it was noticed that their seizures were also getting better. And somebody said, well, maybe this not only will help with the tumors, but can also help with the disruption that causes seizures. And sure enough, they did a randomized controlled trial, and they showed that there was a substantial reduction in seizures, even in children who didn't have these tumors in their brain, if they were given everolimus. And on April 10th, everolimus was approved for the add-on treatment of adults and pediatric patients aged 2 years and older with tuberous sclerosis associated partial onset seizures. So this really is the first drug that is working on what we know to be wrong in the brain that caused these children and adults to have seizures. And we hope that this is just one of many such treatments that we will be finding and testing over the next decade. So in conclusion, we have a very robust pipeline. I wasn't able to show you everything, but I hope I showed you a few things that are exciting. Many new anti-epileptic drugs are being evaluated in the clinic, and many more are about to emerge, and many of them are very promising. But every new drug will need to undergo clinical trials and clinical testing similar to what I showed you here. And we absolutely need the support of the community to enroll in these trials. A lot of the people who did, stand up and enroll in these trials are now, experiencing a benefit of the drugs that they used in the trials. And the nice thing about these trials is that, yes, you can be randomized to a sugar pill during the trial, but the drugs that you're already taking are not taken away. So you're still on the medications that you've been given initially. And also after the duration of the placebo-controlled part of the trial, everybody in almost every circumstance is given the opportunity to try the experimental drug to see whether it's going to work for them. So with that, I will stop and I will ask for questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. French. That was wonderful. We will now begin our Q&A session. Again, if you have questions, please submit them in the questions tab to the GoToWebinar control panel and click send, and Brandon can go ahead and read them aloud. So Brandon,
I'll tell you in advance, we did receive a lot of questions, so I'll try to get through as many as I can given the time available. More of a clarification question to start out, Dr. French. You mentioned Schedule 1 and Schedule 2. Can you kind of explain these different stages a little bit further?
So this is there are drugs that are considered to be controlled substances, which means that people can become dependent or get addicted to them. And the more likelihood that there is that people will get addicted to them, the higher the level of control that the government puts on the distribution of those drugs. So we all, think of drugs like heroin and morphine. And heroin, in fact, is the most controlled of drugs because it is so addictive, and also because it has no medicinal use. And the drugs that are in the Schedule 1 are considered to be highly addictive and have no medicinal use whatsoever. People are kind of surprised to know cocaine, for example, is not Schedule 1 because there is a use of cocaine for some eye diseases, so it's actually Schedule 2. It's extremely difficult to even do research on Schedule 1 compounds because they are so highly regulated by the government. And very difficult. Obviously, you can't prescribe them because they have no medicinal use. Once a drug is known to have a medicinal use and it becomes Schedule 2, then it is much more easier to move that product around, to have it in pharmacies without like 10,000 locks on every door where this substance is being held, and it just makes things much easier. And then you go down the line. So, for example, many of our epilepsy drugs are on the schedule of potentially addictive drugs. You'd be surprised, drugs that perhaps are people who take them would say, I can't imagine anybody would use these if they didn't have to. But there is some evidence that, in fact, people do try and get them for recreational use and not for medicinal use, and that includes drugs such as pregabalin or Lyrica, drugs such as Vimpat or lacosamide. So yes, those are restricted to some degree, but they're only Schedule 4, so they're lightly restricted. As you go up to Schedule 3, Schedule 2, and Schedule 1, you get more and more restriction.
Great, thank you. Next question. Actually received a few questions actually on this topic, but drugs such as Epidiolex and fenfluramine and drugs that are being developed for Dravet syndrome, for instance, will they be available to others with similar seizures but may not have the Dravet or that clinical diagnosis?
It's a very good question. So in the United States specifically, the FDA doesn't put restrictions on doctors to say you can only prescribe a drug for what it has been FDA approved for and is on the FDA label. The studies that are done and the diseases that are studied in the trials will lead to a label that says this has been shown to be safe and effective in condition A, B, or C. I could prescribe that drug for condition D, E, and F, but there are a couple of issues that I would have to have in mind as a physician. Number one is that there is a certain amount of liability because I am going what's called off-label. So, my patient that I'm treating might say, I came to some harm from what you did, and really you weren't doing the proper thing because the FDA didn't say it was approved for this particular indication. So you are taking on some risk when you prescribe off-label, although many people do it. I mean, it's done all the time. The second thing is that your insurance company might say, hey, this is a reasonably expensive drug, and nobody has said that for your condition it's effective, so why are we going to pay for it? So one of two things can happen. It may be that your doctor can then appeal to the insurance company and provide extra information, and the insurance company can eventually agree to pay for it, or they may just completely not agree under any circumstances. And we have had that issue arise with one of our other drugs that is only approved for what we call an orphan condition, and that is clobazam or Onfi. It's a reasonably expensive drug, and it's only approved for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And sometimes I can get it for my patients, and sometimes the insurance company will just completely stonewall and say, no, you can't have it.
Great, thank you. The next question actually deals with the cenobamate trial that you referenced earlier, and a few actually asked if we know what the mechanism of action in that study was?
There's some very, very smart people out there asking questions. So so cenobamate, we do not specifically know the mechanism of action. However, it is in the class of drugs called carbamates. And there was one other drug that was approved for epilepsy that's in that class, and that is felbamate. So we do not know its mechanism. We know that it is somewhat related. It's a second cousin or a third cousin of felbamate. Felbamate was a very effective drug for many people with epilepsy, but as many of the audience may know, it is used very rarely now because it caused serious liver problems and aplastic anemia, which has not been seen with this drug. So if it was as efficacious as felbamate, that would be a good thing, and perhaps in some conditions it's more. And the rest remains to be seen.
Well, that was a great answer because you actually answered my next two questions with that answer, so that was great. The next question will go back to the Epidiolex study. Will Epidiolex have to be descheduled by the DEA after FDA approval?
I am really not entirely familiar with that process. I think that it's not an instantaneous change. I'm going to ask Dr. Lubbers whether she has any idea about the answer to that.
That is a great question, and we can certainly look into it.
Okay.
Great, thank you. The next question actually deals with targeted treatments for the genetic epilepsies outside of Dravet. Do we know whether there are targeted treatments for those epilepsies in development?
I think that the first answer is yes. There are, and on the slide that I showed, there were a couple of genetic conditions that there are targeted treatments. Excuse me. So GLUT1 deficiency is a great example where these are children who have a genetic defect that prevents their brains from turning glucose into energy. So they sort of have an energy defect in the brain. And over time, that leads to seizures as well as an increase in cognitive dysfunction. And there is a targeted therapy that of a drug that can be used by the brain to produce energy that's not glucose, and therefore could reverse the specific problem in these children. So that is one example of a treatment that is specifically targeting one genetic condition. There is a drug called ganaxolone that is being tried specifically in children with CDKL5, which is another specific genetic defect. It doesn't reverse the specific issue in CDKL5, but there are reasons to believe it might be effective in CDKL5. So, there are a number of drugs that are specifically targeting genetic defects. I think that what you may also be asking is, are we trying to reverse the genetic defect that caused the epilepsy to begin with, as was the case with the tuberous sclerosis and everolimus? And there are some attempts at that. They're a little bit further away probably from the clinic, but for example, there's a drug called adalurin that's being tested in children with genetic code problems where there's a certain part of the gene that's supposed to create a protein that is very important for the development or the running of the brain. But when that gene is being read, it comes upon a mutation, and that whole mechanism stops. It's called the stop codon. And that protein can't be created. And this drug actually allows the information in the gene to be read even when that mutation is kind of in the middle of it, and that protein to be created. So that would be really amazing if that works. and it might actually be able to prevent the disease if it was given early enough to a child who had that genetic defect. So these are kind of the almost science fiction things that are turning into reality in clinical trials.
Great, thank you. This actually referenced a slide earlier, but when you said the period of follow-up is 8 weeks or 12 weeks, are they on the drug during those 8 to 12 weeks, or do they stop taking the drug and see what happens for the next 8 to 12 weeks?
So it's also a good question. So the way trials work is usually they start with what's called a baseline period, which is just a period where we can figure out what the frequency, the typical frequency of seizures is. So let's say an individual has 4 seizures a month or 5 seizures a month or 10 seizures a month. Whatever that number is, it's determined during an 8-week baseline. And then at the end of that baseline, they get randomized and they continue on there during the baseline and during the study. They're continuing to take whatever medication their physician has given them, a combination of medications that is the best control that they can get. But at that point, they are randomized to either adding the new drug or adding a sugar pill. And then for 8 to 12 weeks, they carry on and they see whether the seizure frequency that was determined during the baseline is actually going to go down or go up or whatever happens. So that goes on for 8 to 12 weeks. And then at the end of that, the randomized portion of the trial is over and they go into what's called the open label extension. And during that time, everybody can be on the medication. The doctor knows the dose. They know that the medication is being administered. They can manipulate it. They can change the background medications or whatever is considered to be optimal for that individual. So during the double blind, they may or may not be taking the study medication, but once they get to the open label extension, everybody is given the study medication on top of the medication that they're already taking.
Great, thank you. Actually answered a few more questions in there as well, so this is phenomenal. One of the questions that I received even prior to the webinar, and one that came up actually in a few other questions that I received during the webinar, are these drugs safe to take, while a woman is pregnant?
So pregnancy, we always advise that drugs that are in clinical trials, women should not go into clinical trials if they are planning pregnancy. And in fact, we have significant safeguards in place. People have to sign a consent that says that during the trial, they will use appropriate birth control so that they will not get pregnant. And we make sure that they are receiving a birth control that's likely to be effective so that they will not get pregnant, because this is not the time when you want to be experimenting to see whether this medication will adversely affect the fetus, because first you want to make sure that the drug actually works, is safe and effective. Once the drug is safe and effective and is approved and is then available to the public, then over time, some women will take it and will become pregnant. And only then can we really know entirely whether the drug is safe during pregnancy. So we have many pregnancy registries that accumulate data on the drugs once they are in the clinic, but it is unfortunately a very slow process. So it may take decades before there are enough women in the registries that we have a really good information about whether the drug is safe in pregnancy or not. So even some of the drugs that have been around for a really long time, and lacosamide is one good example, we don't have enough information really to say for an absolute assuredness that it is safe in pregnancy. We do have information as immediately when the drug is approved as to whether it caused birth defects in animals. So the label that's put on the drug by the FDA will say either the drug has been shown to be safe in animals, but we don't know about humans, or the drug has been shown not to be safe in animals, but we don't know about humans, or the drug has been shown to be harmful in animals and harmful in humans. So that gives them an A, B, C, or D rating, and the higher the letter, the worse it is. So a D, class D drug would be one where it's been shown, and this is valproic acid or Depakote is in this class, that is both harmful in animals and also has been shown to be harmful in people during pregnancy. And the A designation is almost never given, where we say, oh, we absolutely know it's as safe as houses and anybody can take it and it's perfectly fine. Most seizure medications are either B or C.
Wonderful, thank you. I think probably we're coming near the end of questions, so I think the appropriate last question of the day might be, where do we get more information on clinical trials?
Good question. So the Epilepsy Foundation actually has a lot of information on epilepsy.com. If people want to know whether there is a trial that they could sign up for, then that is an excellent place to look. There is a section of epilepsy.com where the trials that are underway are described, a little bit of information about what we know about the drug and what the trial would be like if you were to enroll in it. So that's one good thing that's on epilepsy.com. And there's also a part of epilepsy.com where there's a pipeline. So you can see all of the drugs that are currently in development and what stage of development they're in, whether they're in early development or they're close to the clinic.
Thank you so much, Dr. French. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Laura for some final words.
Yes, thank you so very much, Dr. French. That was a really helpful presentation. You reviewed a lot of really exciting things that are coming forward for our community. I also want to thank our sponsors, Synovian, for hosting today's webinar. And I'd like to thank our audience for being so engaged and asking some great questions that we'll have to follow up on, at least for one. If you do have questions about this topic or any of CURE's other research programs, please do visit our website at www.cureepilepsy.org, or you can email us at info@cureepilepsy.org. So with that, I want to thank you all once again, and please do stay tuned for our next webinars that will be announced very soon. Take care.